Test 49, section 4, question 23, a counselor says, constantly comparing oneself to those one sees as more able or more successful almost invariably leads to self-disparagement. You know what almost invariably means? It means not invariably. I mean, like, invariably means always. You're saying almost always. Okay, well, that means it probably means more than half the time. I think we could give them that. I actually think it means probably 51 to 99. But it certainly does suggest the possibility of 51 to 99% of the time. It certainly suggests the possibility that it's not 100% of the time. Okay, anyway, most of the time that's what's going to happen. If you compare yourself to someone that you perceive as higher than you, better than you, then you start talking shit about yourself. Almost invariably. Maybe some people don't. Conversely, constantly comparing oneself to those one sees as less able or less successful almost invariably leads to being dismissive of others. So again, there could be exceptions here, but most of the time, if you compare yourself to somebody lower than you, then you're going to dismiss those people. Okay, so let's say you're a 150 LSAT student currently. If you compare yourself to 170s, you might start self-disparaging. And if you compare yourself to 130s, then you might start being dismissive of those people. That would be mean. So what? So, they say, there's another real short word there that's indicating the conclusion. So, those who, for the most part, refrain from comparing themselves to others will most likely be, on the whole, self-accepting and accepting of others. This is the LSAT's most common flaw. This is the flaw of confusing sufficient for necessary, or necessary for sufficient. Same thing. Like, if you do either of these things, then I know that you will probably self-disparage or you will probably be dismissive of others. But if you don't do those things, if you don't compare yourself to someone more successful, if you don't compare yourself to someone less successful, you could still be very judgmental against yourself, and you could still be very judgmental against others. You could be totally dismissive of everybody else, and you could be totally self-disparaging, even if you don't do these comparisons. Right? Like, if you jump off a cliff or lay down in the road, you're probably going to go to the hospital. Therefore, if you don't jump off a cliff and don't lay down in the road, you're not going to go to the hospital? No, because there's lots of other things that might send you to the hospital. This argument is doing exactly that. It's the LSAT's most common flaw, confusing necessary and sufficient. The counselor's reasoning is most vulnerable to criticism because it what? Yeah, the answer could say, like, it could be real technical and it could say you have confused sufficient conditions for necessary conditions. There's lots of different ways that they could describe it in technical terms. They could also say something like you're neglecting the possibility that you could self-disparage because of any other reason, or you're neglecting the possibility that you could be dismissive of others for any other reason, just because you're a dick, And so the correct answer can point out that flaw with specifics. It could be like, maybe you're just an asshole. That's why you dismiss people. Has nothing to do with whether you're comparing yourself or not. That's a possible correct answer here. Okay, so did the argument A overlook the possibility that one can compare oneself both to those one perceives to be more able and more successful than oneself, and to those one perceives to be less able? What? No. You're neglecting the possibility that you could self-disparage or dismiss for other reasons. A is just muddying the waters. Like, I guess they did overlook the possibility that you could do both of these things at the same time. You could compare yourself to the 170s and compare yourself to the 130s at the same time. I guess they did overlook that possibility. But who cares? That's not a good objection to their argument. A good objection to their argument is that you could be self-disparaging even if you don't compare yourself to people who are better than you or more successful than you. B, overlooks the possibility that constantly comparing oneself to others may have beneficial effects. I wouldn't read that one any further. I would say that's not the point. You claimed that I was never going to be, you said I would be self accepting and accepting of others if I didn't do this comparison. And the problem with that is that there might be a lot of other ways where I could not accept myself and not accept other people, even if I'm not doing that comparison. And, B's just talking about like, well, but there could be good effects if you do these. Who cares? I'm attacking their conclusion that they actually made. C, takes for granted that if one is both dismissive of others and self-disparaging, one will not be self-accepting and accepting of others. Huh? You told me I wasn't going to be dismissive of others. You told me I wasn't going to be self-disparaging. C's like, well, but what if you're both? That has nothing to do with attacking this argument. D, overlooks the possibility that self-disparagement and being dismissive of others can result from something other than comparing oneself to others. Yeah. Maybe I'm just an asshole. Or maybe I'm just depressed. That's why I self-disparage all the time. And maybe the depression is what also causes me to dismiss others. Maybe I dismiss myself and others all the time because of my depression, and maybe that has nothing to do with comparing myself to them. Answer is D because it nails the confusion of sufficient and necessary. Notice that they didn't put those words into that answer choice, but nonetheless, that answer choice is pointing out specifically, rather than in the abstract, it's pointing it out in the specific instance that, hey, you could still self-disparage, you could still dismiss others for any other reason. E, takes for granted that whenever one compares oneself to others, one sees them as more successful and more able than oneself, or less successful and less able than oneself. It didn't actually do that, because this argument leaves open the possibility that maybe you can compare yourself to people who are exactly, situated the same as you are situated. And they're not taking for granted that anytime you compare yourself, that you're always going to be comparing yourself to a 170 or to a 130. They just didn't talk about what happens when you compare yourself to a 150. That's not the same thing as taking for granted that that's never possible. So D is the only one that describes what they did. It is the LSAT's most common flaw, and that's the answer.